power on.
This is the day you have trained for, the day you have studied for. Utilize your superior skills, your superior intelligence.
Sit down, rodent.
Oh dear.
Sarah, baby. Oh, you were one.
Don't make me hurt you.
Learn to defeat your ruthless enemy, Steve of Hackensack.
Brian, you're gonna get roofed.
Shut up, quadruped.
Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
Now entering the gaming grid. The latest gaming news, reviews, and retro culture, as only the man of tomorrow can deliver. And here's your host, Brian Sovryn.
Woo! One of the top 200 tech podcasts, I guess I should say, in Hong Kong, baby. I'm not kidding. And I have no idea why, or at least that's according to Apple's statistics. Not that I care much about Apple or those statistics, but there you go. It's just a weird thing. I started getting emails, notifications from people saying, hey, you're ranking in Apple Podcasts. You know, we'd like to talk to you, blah, blah, blah. And mind blowing. But regardless, we're not here to talk about that. We are here for another Sovryn Top 8, continuing a series that had been going throughout 2020. And we are going to talk about what is arguably, even though a lot of the consoles that we have been talking about. So this is basically a gaming grid special, if you didn't already catch that. A lot of the consoles we've been talking about lately, like the original Xbox, the Sega Saturn, and so on, could be argued to be quantum leaps, or at least major leaps in available technologies, and very much redefining what a console could do. I would argue that, and we made this point when we talked about the original Xbox, the OG Xbox, that the original Xbox was really only appreciated any success because the Sega Dreamcast, which is what we're doing a top 8 here for, is because the Sega Dreamcast had been considered by Sega to be a failure. And they, Microsoft picked up all of those many anyway, of those franchises and games that were, originally probably would have been sequels released, say, on the Dreamcast, right? Like Jet Set Radio Future and so on. They ended up on the Xbox. Now, a lot of them certainly also ended up in, as well as re-releases or even remakes of a type, would end up on the GameCube and PlayStation 2 as well. But I think the Xbox specifically, minus Halo, really did well because of a lot of what would ultimately be Dreamcast sequels being available on that console. And that console, of course, really, it was an innovative console, and we talked about that, but ultimately it was just, the reason the thing was such a hulk, was so fucking big, was because it was just a little PC. It wasn't even, and what's a computer and what's not isn't everything. Yeah, we could get into that, but really it was PC parts tossed into something that looked like a console, right? It was the Steam machine before Steam machines were a thing. And where are even those? But the Dreamcast, on the other hand, was a true innovation. And I have said many times that I wouldn't argue against it being called the greatest console of all time, just on feature set alone. And also on feature set, the most innovative, with some things done on it that have yet to be really replicated in any way. And in fact, it's one of those consoles, and this is true for really actually both the Saturn and the Dreamcast. It's one of those consoles where it really just never felt right to emulate, because there's so many little things about it, and it's so many little Sega things about it that it just, it feels like you want the original hardware. Now for the Dreamcast, which of course originally came out in Japan in 1998, would come out on what was considered at the time to be the biggest day in video game history. Came out on September 9th, 1999 in the United States. So it was 9999, right? That was a really clever marketing strategy, I have to admit. I mean, I've never forgotten it. Had the amazing tagline of, "Shh, it's thinking." Remember that? Maybe I'll clip that in at the beginning of this. But yeah, I mean, and it only had, from 98, basically it ran until 2001, part of the 6th generation of gaming consoles, which of course that I would argue is the last great generation of home consoles anyway. Handheld wise, different story. Because the Vita and the 3DS, I mean, are just tanks, as far as consoles go. And I mean, arguments could be made that those are, in many ways, I mean, especially when you get into homebrew, they become the greatest consoles ever made, like perhaps even flat out. But, a lot of that's subjective, sure. But the feature set for the Dreamcast is far from a subjective metric. And the game list is actually really good, and a lot of very experimental games on it. But regardless of innovative features and a lot of great games, and a starting price back at $99.99 for selling for $199, which is crazy to consider, a top tier console being sold for that low a price. It didn't happen. The sales weren't there, depending upon region, but really just the sales weren't there. Sega could not recoup the loss. I mean, Sega had basically, I think a lot of people want to argue that they got lucky with the Genesis. I don't know that they got lucky. They just capitalized on a demographic that Nintendo wasn't exactly interested in appeasing or appealing to. And so I don't see that as luck. I think that their marketing, the attitude around what Sega was doing was top notch. I do think that there were some failed business moves. I'm not going to say that, or I'm not going to deny that, I should say. But regardless, the Dreamcast is an absolutely, to this day, a viable system. And there are a lot of games that were released for the Dreamcast that have never been re-released. Ever. And it seems an odd omission that in 2019, which would have been, for America, the 20th anniversary of the Dreamcast, that and I think it was basically in September of 2019 that we got the Genesis Mini, right? It's strange. Like, why not do the Dreamcast Mini? You had all the nostalgia, all the right dates lined up for it. And hell, you probably could have sold the thing. I mean, just to keep with the, with the 99999, right? You probably could have sold the thing for $99 and people would have bought it. Especially if you included a VMU, like a real controller and all this other stuff. I mean, that could have been some okay money, I would think, for Sega. And it makes less sense when you look at the fact that they've done like mini consoles of the Astro 6 or like the mini Game Gear that they did, which was just fucking pointless, but they put money into this crap. And I'm baffled that they didn't take advantage. Because again, and as you'll see when we get into this top 8, there are a lot of games that they've never seen the light of day anywhere else. And they are games that many, gamers that were at least alive at the time very, very well remember, very fondly remember. I mean, yeah, sure. Jet Grind Radio or Jet Set Radio, depending upon what you want to call it, has been re-released fucking everywhere. For some reason, Future hasn't. Its sequel, but of course that was for the OG Xbox. But there are plenty of games that have just never been re-released or covered again that were available for the system. And like I say, you'll see that as we get into it. So if I were to talk about, though, if you were to ask me, why did the Dreamcast ultimately fail? What was it? If the hardware was fine, if the game library was good enough, and there's all these wild innovations that it had, why did it fail? Well, partly I'll say this. Like the Saturn, much of the ideas involved were ahead of their time. Now, if you're a PC gamer, you already have been on top of anything that any console has ever put out. You were on top of it back in 1993. Okay. Let's be clear about that. So, because I mean, one of the major features that the Dreamcast, really touted, I mean, to the point that they actually did a deal with Microsoft, right? Remember Windows CE was basically going to run on, or was basically running on Dreamcast. And I mean, that didn't necessarily go anywhere, but Dreamcast was going to pick up from where the Saturn left off with having a web browser and all this. And then you had Phantasy Star Online, right? Which was, massive multiplayer. I mean, that's before World of Warcraft dropped. And that was a big deal. That was an absolute innovation, as far as consoles go. Again, PC gaming, whatever, people are playing Ultima, don't worry about it. But for consoles, that was insane. So despite all that, what was the recipe for disaster here? Well, I think that you could argue that there just weren't enough big games available for it. And there might be some truth in that, but and we could get into, well, the thing is that when the PlayStation 2 came along, like that could do 20 million, independent polygons per second, right? Or whatever, whatever their numbers are. What was it? The emotion engine and the graphics synthesizer processors or chips that, that Sony spent preposterous amounts of money on, and because, well, the Dreamcast could only do 3 to 6 million, and 20 million is just more. No, I don't think that's it. Graphics are one thing, and certainly at the time, like graphics still really mattered. If you could make a giant leap in that, I wouldn't argue that that's where that's why. Oh well, the Dreamcast just didn't look pretty enough. I mean that's nonsense, right? Because the GameCube certainly wasn't powering at those levels either. And it did very well for itself. The Xbox, you could get into similar territory, okay, and similar arguments around that. I think that Sega, while they did appreciate their history, okay, and I've had interviews with Bernie Stoller, who was the head of Sega of America at the time, and I've talked about this, and he would talk about varying missteps, that say, would come down. And you can even see this, I think, now in documentaries that have been made about it, where he feels that there are missteps being made by Sega of Japan. I think their biggest flaw was that there was no real backwards compatibility with, frankly, tremendous games that were available for the Sega Saturn. The PlayStation 2 had two key elements going for it, and one of them made it a no-brainer to buy. The most important one was the fact that it was a DVD player at a time when not many people anyway had DVD players, and DVD players on the regular would cost about $300 just for a DVD player. Now you're getting a DVD player and a PlayStation 2, and here's the key, and a PlayStation 1. Right? Because, at the time when the PlayStation 2 came out, everybody was still talking about Final Fantasy VII or, whatever big game, that would end up. I mean, and we did the top 8 for the Sony PlayStation. So, you know what that score looks like. There's plenty to be had. I mean, some of the weirdest and wildest and most beautiful games ever made. And you were able to play those as well, especially if, I don't know, maybe you'd went with Nintendo during the 5th generation and you bought an N64 and you never got the time to get into PlayStation games. Well, when you bought a PlayStation 2, you got a DVD player, a PlayStation 2, and a PlayStation 1, effectively. Dreamcast, yes, it had that $199 price tag that was nice, but there wasn't enough on offer. And I mean, I would argue the GameCube fell prey very much to the same thing. Just Nintendo's, franchises, their IP stands so strong that it moves units on its own. I mean, and like, just look at what happened. I mean, they created the entire fucking mini console industry, just on that strength alone. So ultimately, I think that's, as wild as some of the stuff, I mean, you got to consider that, well, okay, the Dreamcast, didn't also play Saturn games. It did have the VMU, which was pretty cute with the VMU. So to understand this, and I think this is probably the best feature that the Dreamcast had. The VMU was the memory card. Remember, you used to have to use those. It was a memory card that you jammed into the controller. Okay. There's rumble packs that you could put in the controller as well. And even a microphone if you were playing Seaman. Oh, we might talk about that. Anyway, So it was a memory card, but it had a screen on it. And that screen actually could show through on a little window on the controller itself. And this, you could play mini games on it, or it could act as a second screen, similar to what like GameCube would do with the GBA link, but maybe not to the point where you could interact with it, with the game so much by using a GBA in the case of the GameCube, but it was a very similar scenario. And so you had a second screen that could prompt certain things or somewhat interact or respond to the action going on the big screen. This is the part that I think other people don't really remember today. And that is like your memory card, whatever console it happened to be for. If it was the memory card for the PlayStation 1, for the PlayStation 2, for your GameCube even, or for Saturns didn't have memory cards, but for your Dreamcast or something like that. I mean, you carried that thing around like that was your badge of honor. You know, whatever was on that memory card was like, this is what you had achieved. This is what you had done. I mean, if you were young enough, you could easily argue everything that fucking mattered to you was on that memory card. I mean, that was the Jew gold around the neck, baby. And so to have that, so you were always, if you're like me, you were always carrying around your memory card. And then for that memory card, I think Sega picked up on this, for that memory card to actually be a mini console, because it actually had little buttons on it. So you could navigate and look at what's on your memory card for one. I mean, that's a nice little feature. Like I said, you're always thinking about, what's the next adventure that I'm going to get to, when I get home from school or something like that. There was that aspect to it, but then there were some games like what I consider to be one of, if not the greatest RPG of all time, that being Skies of Arcadia. With games like Skies of Arcadia, you could actually play mini games that would help advance you in the main game on the Dreamcast on your VMU. Insane. So in some ways, it was two consoles in one. In some ways. Now, a lot of developers didn't take advantage of the VMU. That might be why that wasn't as big of a deal, because it wasn't long into the life of the Dreamcast. It's a very short life, that instead, even Sega was selling, what they called 4X memory cards, meaning that they were memory cards that they got rid of the screen and they just put a ton more storage onto it. And it had 4 times the storage of what your average VMU would have. And I think that's a pity, because it was such a brilliant idea. And if Sega had some kind of Pokemon game at the time, and I know there were games in that vein that existed on the Dreamcast, but if they had some kind of property like Pokemon, or if they had bought into the brilliant thing that they could have done is if they made a deal with Enix to bring in the Dragon Quest series. And they could have done like little slime games on the VMU. That would have really put them over the top. So I'm saying all of this to suggest that the real reason that I think that, there's never just one, but the real reason that the Dreamcast failed. Yes, they didn't make enough money off of the previous generation with the Saturn, and they had to rush into the Dreamcast. But ultimately it came down to is just there wasn't enough on offer in comparison to the PlayStation 2. And all I mean by that isn't the games, isn't the hardware, isn't the graphics. It's the fact that the PlayStation 2 was basically 3 things in one. It was the DVD player, it was the PlayStation 2, it was the PlayStation 1. If Dreamcast, who knows? History could have been very different if the Dreamcast could even play a Saturn game, but it couldn't. And Sega did not take advantage of a lot of re-releases, really. There were some, but they didn't do a lot of re-releases for the Dreamcast, which might have helped stave that. Certainly Nintendo would engage in that kind of heavily with the GameCube and certainly with the Wii. But regardless, that's where I think the failure happened. And again, it is sad because it is a system, like I said, where there are games there that to this day are nowhere else. Fortunately, it's actually, getting a Dreamcast today and getting to play off of original hardware, more or less, is an incredibly attractive proposition, in 2020 going into 2021. That is largely due to, in my opinion, to Terra Onion. Terra Onion, of course, came out with their Mode, which is the multi-system optical disc emulator, or multi-console. And the mode is one board that works in multiple consoles and instantly recognizes what console it's in and then emulates the optical disk drive on the console and lets you just slap in an SD card or, even an SSD, whatever, your USB stick, whatever, and play the games directly off of that. So we talked about this because I got my hands on one of these. I was one of the original backers. It's not really a backer. You pre-ordered, but I was one of the original pre-orders, waited months to get my hands on it for the mode. And I got it specifically because I wanted to deal with the Saturn. There is a part of me that really wants to get my hands on another one and do a Dreamcast. I don't want to switch it between systems because I just love having that crisp look, of the console, and I don't want to have to keep opening them up and all that crap. So anyway, that is an incredibly attractive proposition because, you could just pop however many, Dreamcast games you want, and this will automate. The VMU works beautifully. All the controllers, all the accessories you can imagine work beautifully. Good luck getting a microphone for a microphone adapter for the Dreamcast controller so that you can play some of the very few games that allowed for the microphone accessory. But you can do it, and you can do it very well, and you don't have to worry about the laser or the optical disk drive ultimately going bad. So it's a worthwhile thing to do. And with that, I really want to go ahead and get into the games. I feel like I've talked about the Dreamcast so many times in Sovereign Tech's history that, I don't think we need to get in too much of the technicals around it. We mentioned some of the innovation. Of course, online play was, again, it wasn't the first, but it definitely took it to new heights of what was possible. The multitude of controllers. The fishing rod controller, the light gun controller. Of course, Dreamcast would be the home of House of the Dead 2. Certainly, just a fantastic, tons of fun, albeit short, but tons of fun game. And the Dreamcast controller itself was incredibly modular. You had the rumble pack that could attach to it. Of course, then you had the VMU. The VMU was so cool, as we just talked about. And even little things like playing CDs on it was kind of wild. It would put on a nice little light show. It didn't have the different, like graphic equalizer effects, kind of like the PlayStation 1 had. But it was certainly a lot more exciting than playing CDs on the PlayStation 2. I'll say that. But it had some interesting effects. It wasn't as cool as playing CDs on the Saturn. That's cool. Granted, you can't really do that. I guess unless you turned a CD into an ISO, which you could do, or a BenQ, and played it on the mode. I was going to say on a mode, you can't really play a CD because it rips out the optical disc, or the disk drive. But, it put on a nice little light show when you do that. I would do that a lot, actually. I can remember many, many times playing Kiss Alive 3 on my Dreamcast. That was fun. Something, I will talk a little bit of history. I was, in fact, it's kind of funny. So at the time when I got my Dreamcast, this is just before I had gone into the military. I had gotten it a little bit later in its life. I didn't know that it was canceled when I got it, but I got it a little bit later in its life. And when I found out it was canceled, instantly my mind goes to, whoa, are all the games going to be on sale? And yes, they were. And I remember walking to the mall. Sometimes almost daily, or at least once a week, I'd be going there and just seeing, because everybody was trading in all their Dreamcast shit. And I'm like, well, I still have tons of games to play on this system. Why would I get rid of it? And I remember Electronics Boutique at the time. This is before they were GameStop. And this is in upstate New York. Electronics Boutique, just had this one large bin, and it was just all the Dreamcast games. And it got to a point where the guy, one of the managers at Electronics Boutique, when I'd come in, he's like, he would just say, clear the Dreamcast aisle. Brian's here. And he'd say, it's like, this guy's keeping the Dreamcast alive on his own. Cause the games would cost nothing. They cost anywhere from $2 to $10, which that was really nothing, especially, even in 2000, 2001. Yeah. I mean, I had a massive Dreamcast library. I played that system to death, and largely because, again, the games were so inexpensive. So you just scoop them up and buy them. I mean, even if you know, at those prices, you take the risk, right? It's like, well, this game, and the internet, you know, wasn't what it was today. Back then, we didn't really have Metacritic or anything. You can't go and look up, oh, is this game any good? You know, blah, blah, blah. You just had to buy and try. But, you know, at $2 to $5 to $10 a game, sure, buy and try. And at GameStop, I mean, I could always, and they knew it, like I could go in there and just trade it in and pick up a different one. And not trade in and like get half value, trade it in, return it, and just pick out a different game. It was an amazing time. I mean, again, really, I played the shit out of that system. And it was such a smooth system, especially with a lot of what Sega did. And we're going to talk about that as we get into these, into the games here. Cause we got to talk about this top 8. It was a system. Yeah. Cause I don't have this on my top 8, but I kind of should. The Virtua Tennis series. Now this started, tennis has had a strange history in video gaming. I've always felt that tennis is it's a sport that has always translated, in my opinion, really, really well to video games in any generation, you know, even on Atari, on the Atari 2600. It was awesome. One of my favorite games on there was tennis. And somehow, you know, like really, Sega hit a piece of perfection when they started the Virtua Tennis series, Virtua Tennis 1 and Virtua Tennis 2 on the Dreamcast. I mean, I played I don't even like tennis, you know, but I played those games to death. Like hitting the bowling pins and everything with that was awesome. And it speaks to that when you get your, you know, game development to the level of art, that it really doesn't matter what exactly the genre is of the game that you're making. I mean, people will just recognize the beauty of what you created. And I feel like Virtua Tennis just had, I don't know, there's almost something peaceful about it. It was, but intense at the same time. Certainly, man, what a great series of games. What a great game. It's not on my list, but I wanted to mention it because I can just remember being up at 7 a.m. I don't mean waking up at 7 a.m. I mean staying up until 7 a.m. and just playing that to death. Yeah, dynamite. Unlockable characters, the whole thing. I mean, it was great. Anyway, it would have been nice if Sonic showed up at some point, but whatever. So now that we have our bit of history around the Sega Dreamcast, why don't we get into our top 8? And we're going to, you know, I tried to make this something that has you know, something a little bit different in it, but there's two that I think most people talk about, that I am going to bring up, because, you know, it'd be like, I don't know, it'd be like talking about the NES and not mentioning The Legend of Zelda. Like, how dare you, you know? Yeah, I mean, you just can't talk, you can't say those things without them being in the same breath. And we'll start off with not Sonic Adventure. Actually, there is not a single Sonic game on this list, which also speaks to that, you know, I get and we talked about this with the Saturn, how, you know, a lot of people say, well, there was no mainline, or, you know, mainstream Sonic game on the Saturn, and that's why the Saturn failed. Nah, I mean, I'm sure that played a part. But I don't think that that's the case, because I think the Dreamcast's best showings had nothing to do with Sonic. And look, Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 were good games. You know, I'm not going to, and I know a lot of people actually don't even like them now, or maybe they like Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, but they're not so hot on the original Sonic Adventure. That Sonic Adventure was awe-inspiring at the time when it came out. People were really wild about that. I still think it's a very good game. But it would not sit in my top 8. Also, it's a game that's been re-released on a million different platforms, and there's plenty of ways to play it. And it's been, you know, fixed to a degree to where, you know, a lot of the little problems don't exist, or some of the camera issues have been fixed and so on. But no, let's start off with number 1. And number 1, you know, as I always say, these top 8s, if you're in the top 8, you're already the best. So it doesn't really matter what number, but Is this the greatest game made for the Dreamcast? Absolutely yes. This is absolutely number one. And that is SoulCalibur. It comes up every time we talk about the Dreamcast, but there's a reason. Because in 1999, it was fucking unheard of for a console. Now, I know the Neo Geo could emulate what was in your, could bring the arcade experience home. That's fine. It brought the arcade experience home. The Neo Geo didn't improve the arcade experience. It just directly translated it. The Dreamcast bested one of the top arcade games at that time, and it bested it on your television at home. That's crazy. Like that was a technical fucking marvel. That's why I say all the crap that, PlayStation 2 does 20 million polygons and, or what, no, none of that matters. Doesn't matter if the Dreamcast only did 6 million. Does not matter. It took on the arcade head on and won. If you were to ask me what killed the arcade, now people wouldn't, I don't know how much people would argue this because, home consoles become so powerful by that point that like, why do I go to the arcade? Yeah, but you got to understand the final nail was when SoulCalibur looked better at home than it did in the fucking arcades. Crazy. Add into the fact that it's a great fighting game. One of the best of all time. Smooth, gorgeous, plenty of unlockables, like all the things you want out of a fighting game. Epic scale. Music that'll fill the room. And just everybody in the game's looking fantastic. It's a perfect game. It's an I try to save my use of the word perfect when it comes to video games for only very special occasions. This is a perfect game. There have been other, the SoulCalibur series goes on to this day. What are we up to? 6 now? And certainly interesting things had been done with SoulCalibur 2 and so on. But SoulCalibur, the first one, really, I still think the two best are the original Soul Blade or Soul Edge, depending upon what region you're in, for the PlayStation 1, and then SoulCalibur for the PlayStation 2. I like SoulCalibur 2, particularly for the GameCube, because you got to play as Link. That was awesome. But those first two were master classes in game development, design, and playing. Just mind-blowing. My only, you had Maxi, right? The character of Maxi in SoulCalibur 2. And the storylines in it were really cool too. But when I found out Li Long wasn't in it, I was like, well, what the fuck? That's my favorite character. But Maxi was pretty good. You get Li Long later on in the series again, but regardless, amazing, and the Dreamcast, for that to be there and ready for launch, at least in America, was a winning move. That should have been enough. That I really feel like, and people might want to talk about Shenmue or something like that, but I really feel like SoulCalibur was, if Sega were smart, they should have tried. And I know they probably looked at Mortal Kombat and said, well, Mortal Kombat tried branching out into other, video game genres and it didn't work, right? Like mythologies or special forces, Shaolin monks and so on. I think they should have, just took those characters, made a deal with Namco and ran. Because everybody was talking about playing and just going crazy about that game and the fact that they could keep playing it for free at home. Now, next game on the list. In fact, I'm kind of surprised at how many fighters are here. A game that really should be on this list, and that usually when people ask, okay, what was great on the Dreamcast that has never been re-released? Usually people bring up this game first. And it's not on my list. I'm going to put in another one, but just to talk about how great Dreamcast was for fighting games. But Power Stone 2. Now, Power Stone 1 and Power Stone 2 both came out on the Dreamcast. These games are just loads of fun. Sega should, I think Capcom owns them. This should be a Smash Brothers alternative. Because we need a Smash Brothers alternative. And as good as Kirby Fighters 2 is, and it is, And I'll play that, frankly, till I die before I play Smash Brothers. But well, you never know, right? Some great character might come into Smash Brothers. Just that community drives me insane. But Power Stone should be a competitor. I'm baffled by this, that there aren't more Power Stone games. Regardless, that could easily be on this list. It's just it's one that everybody kind of points at. So I didn't include it here for that reason. Kind of similar to why I didn't mention or why, Sonic Adventure isn't on the list. But yes, Power Stone 2 is a tremendous, I mean, and you can get into, because it's more than 2 players. I mean, you just get into wild action on those games or on that game. But the fighter I'm actually going to include here is kind of a rarer one. And it's Heavy Metal Geomatrix. And it's from 2001. Probably didn't do so well because it came out late in the life of the Dreamcast, basically just around the time that it would end up getting canceled. Fortunately, it did get released, unlike Half-Life. There were games that were, announced, and in fact, they even put strategy guides in stores for games that were going to come out for the Dreamcast that never came out because Sega canceled, the Dreamcast itself. Half-Life was one of those. But Heavy Metal Geomatrix did come out. It's a 3D fighter. Very similar to your Tekkens or even SoulCaliburs. I mean, there's weapons, all kinds of crazy shit in it. What really puts this over the top, has a great design. The story is your typical, heavy metal fare, and heavy metal as in, the magazine, right? Which, like the 2 movies came from and so on. If you're a heavy metal fan, you know exactly what you're getting here. And what was amazing about it was really the soundtrack. And because the soundtrack was absolutely heavy metal. Megadeth was on the soundtrack. Rob Halford, of course, of Judas Priest, is on the soundtrack. You can find the soundtrack out there to download. It's a killer soundtrack. And it just upped the action so much to have. I mean, I could see at the time that like a lot of younger folk maybe wouldn't have appreciated the music that was on offer in this game, but you mix in, because this is, the Xbox wasn't a thing yet where we talked about the feature that you could, play your own music in games, even though that was kind of limited. This might be one of the best, if not the best, like game soundtracks with licensed music ever, as in not original music to the game. Just a kick-ass track list. And to have that play, like, I mean, as soon as you're, pounding somebody down, listening to Rob Halford, it's on. I mean, that was no small thing even in 2001. And yeah, I know you could just play the music on your stereo independent from the console, but it was different. It really, when it was in the game, it just worked. Really, really impressive. I love the game, and it was a good looking game at the time too. So Heavy Metal Geomatrix at number 2. Number 3. Yeah, we'll put it in, Jet Grind Radio. I'm tempted, to put something else here, but we're going to go with it. Number 3, Jet Grind Radio. What can be said about this game that hasn't already been said a billion times? So a lot of people don't know this about me. Actually now I hope a lot of people know this about me because I've mentioned it here and there on Sovereign Tech. And I don't say this as a boast, but it might as well be. I am a award-winning, like medal-winning, championship roller skater. And I'm not joking. I know. You see me in real life, maybe, and you're like, what, it's like, what's Hulk Hogan doing over there? No, whatever you think. I don't know. But what's that big guy doing over there? And yes, I can fly on a pair of skates. And while there have been games, I mean, I could think of, what was it, like Roller Jam or whatever, I don't know, or roller games. There have been games that have included roller skating in them. This was a game where like you really had that free form motion on roller skates. They were really like jet skates, but regardless, it was the same concept. And the music was so cool in it and really weird, and just the art style, the cell shading, that was a fairly new trick at the time. It's a must play experience. And it's another one where Sega, what are you doing? make more of these games. It's not even hard you could just copy what you've already done and people would be fucking happy. Just give us more levels, just think them out. And anyway, this is a must play experience on the Dreamcast, and it's just as good as its sequel, Jet Set Radio Future, on the original Xbox. But it is an experience. And in America, I mean, there was nothing else like it. Similar to, say, like Space Channel 5. Now, Space Channel 5 has been made available on other systems, of course. That originally started on the Dreamcast. But I'd be remiss without, this didn't get ported onto, I mean, now it's like on PC. You can play it even on your smartphone at one point. I mean, it was kind of all over the place. But just a brilliant, brilliant fucking, just gorgeous game. So let's move on. Let's go to number 4. And in fact, this is funny because it's another fighter. And the fighter is Project Justice from the year 2000. This is a sequel, one of a few, where oddly, some sequels to PlayStation 1 games ended up, and they weren't Sega properties, ended up on the Dreamcast. You would think they would have ended up on the PlayStation 2, but it didn't happen. Project Justice is a 3D fighting game, and it is the sequel to kind of what you could call an underground hit, maybe even a sleeper hit on the PlayStation 1, that being Rival Schools. Rival Schools is, I mean, it's not that different from, say, a Tekken, but the storyline in it that deals around, these competing high schools, not an uncommon storyline in Japanese fiction, regardless of medium. It's a really, really cool storyline. And some of the ways, like the unique ways that the combos work in it and everything, they are really cool games, but it all comes down to the storylines and the characters. And I love Rival Schools, and Project Justice. Ironically, I don't think it looks as good. I mean, yes, it has more polygons, sure, but I don't think it looks as cool as, I guess maybe that's what I should say. It doesn't look as cool as as Rival Schools on PlayStation 1, but Project Justice as a sequel is a full-on sequel. Storyline continues and everything, and it's basically the only continuation of the storyline that you get. And fighters with actually really impressive storylines are fairly rare. It's part of the reason that SoulCalibur, that whole series has, I think, stuck. I mean, Tekken has a storyline, I know Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter has them. They all have storylines, but their execution's a different story. And Rival Schools does a really fantastic job of executing the story and sticking more or less with one storyline as well. So probably want to check that out. That's a rarer one that I don't think a lot of people remember. Quick, I'll just mention it. Another rare one, and where it's a case of the original came out on PlayStation 1, and then the sequel would end up coming out on Dreamcast and not get released anywhere else. In fact, this is a game, just like Project Justice, I don't think it's ever been re-released. And that's Plasma Sword. Nightmare of Bilstein. Plasma Sword is a sequel to a game called Star Gladiator on the PlayStation 1 by Capcom. And I mean, you're basically a character with like a lightsaber, more or less. And it's a really, really cool, like 3D action game. And Plasma Sword, which is the sequel to Star Gladiator, just delivered on all fronts with that. You can play the lead character from Star Gladiator. I think they're in like the Marvel versus Capcom games. I think he shows up at some point, but anyway, of course, that's a game that could easily be on here too, is Marvel versus Capcom 2. That would get released on other systems, but that was a major, major coup for the Dreamcast at the time. I mean, just to have that awesome tag team action and that roster. I mean, the roster was just insane on that game. But, I mentioned lightsabers, so let's move on. But Plasma Sword, check that out. Let's move on to something that this was a re-release, not a sequel to a PlayStation 1 game, but a re-release of a PlayStation 1 game that might as well be an entirely other game. And that is Star Wars Episode 1 Jedi Power Battles. See what I did there with the lightsaber? Jedi Power Battles is a fine game on the PlayStation 1. On the Dreamcast, it's a whole other beast. The graphics are significantly improved. Because here's the thing is that, so Jedi Power Battles is kind of this weird, it's not really a side-scrolling beat 'em up, but sort of, but it's not using like drawn, characters, like say a Streets of Rage or something. Or, we're more two-dimensional. It's far more a three-dimensional experience. And that lends to all kinds of problems, like where you're supposed to land on a conveyor belt and you end up jumping off the side because of the 3D and the camera's just, things are very small on the screen. And when you have in this case, when you have a low polygon count, it becomes an issue. On the Dreamcast, that issue is solved. But more importantly, this is, ironically, as we've been talking about this whole time, this is another great fighting game on the Dreamcast. It's not billed as a fighting game. If you play it on the PlayStation 1, it's not a fighting game. But when you play it on the Dreamcast, there's a whole other element, kind of like how some of the Double Dragon games, depending upon what system you play them on, will have a mode where you can just do combat between the different characters in Double Dragon instead of doing the side-scrolling beat 'em up. Same thing happened with Jedi Power Battles for Dreamcast, where you could just pick Plo Koon and take on Mace Windu, and you have these, varying arenas that you can fight within. And that's what was great. PlayStation 1 doesn't even have that mode. That mode sold the whole game because you basically had a true Star Wars fighting game, lightsabers and all, that Masters of Terrascasi couldn't even dream of being. Phenomenal. This is, and never re-released. Never re-released. I mean, the PlayStation 1 version is fine too, but it does not have the almost infinite replayability that Jedi Power Battles does. I would almost argue that the fighting action in it, it's not as good as like Jedi Academy on PC, but for what it is, it's pretty damn good. I mean, it's a lot of fun to do that. Reminds me of, and this is something else that's actually available on the Dreamcast, which was only otherwise originally available on the N64, and that is San Francisco Rush 2049. That's a game where, okay, it's a great racing game, but where it's really great is when you get into battle mode, and that's when the game goes through the roof. That is if you don't have like the Midway Arcade Treasures series or anything, that includes San Francisco Rush 2049, or if you don't have an N64, the Dreamcast is a solid way, and it was the way that me and my buddies played it the most at the time, is the way to play that fucking game. You've got to play San Francisco Rush 2049 if you never have. Talk about perfect game. But again, the racing game is awesome itself, and it's really cool, very futuristic. All that's a lot of fun. Doing all the loop-de-loops and everything is great. But the battle mode is, you won't stop. You'll keep playing. It'll turn 4 a.m. and you had no idea. That's how that's going to go. But that's another one of those cases where, okay, like, yeah, there's the main game, but then there's that other mode of the game that, ooh, no, that's where it's all at, and Jedi Power Battles is a similar case as far as that goes. Now, I should have put Jet Grind Radio somewhere else, or I should have put something else in there, but there is something I do want to talk about that I was tempted to put in the place of Jet Grind Radio, but I'll get to that at the end. Let's go to number 6. Number 6. Look around. It's another fighting game. Really, I don't know why people don't talk about this more. The amount of fighting games that the Dreamcast had, especially some exclusives, were nuts. This one, in fact, is exceptionally rare. In fact, when I did my Saturn Top 8, its predecessor was on that list, that being Virtua Fighter Remix. Virtua Fighter 3, but not just Virtua Fighter 3, Virtua Fighter 3 TB, it was another case where it competed with what was in arcades, but it one-upped the whole situation by turning Virtua Fighter into a team battle game. This would end up coming out in 99. It was a launch title, wildly popular in Japan. I don't know why it didn't take off in America so much, but Virtua Fighter 3 TB, and the TB part is important. Virtua Fighter 3 is great too, but the TB part, the team battle, like they changed a lot of the finishers. It was almost like a totally new game. And the team element, the only game I could think of that comes close, and yeah, there's Tekken Tag Tournament, and certainly, like I said, Capcom versus Marvel had that team element to it. The only thing I can really compare it to, because it was so pick up and play, like the Virtua Fighter series had been early on, in comparison, I would say, to like your Street Fighters and Mortal Kombats. It was so pick up and play. The only thing I can compare it to is like Power Rangers Battle for the Grid, which is a recent game for modern consoles. But it's in that vein where the team action just flows so nicely and allows for, or, you know, you could compare it to like a Capcom versus Marvel, and they probably copied that style. But they did it to great effect and in 3D, which is also very rare, like real 3D. Awesome. And it's Virtua Fighter. So, I mean, you know what you're getting there, but that was a lot of fun. Launch title. I don't think maybe it wasn't a launch title in America, or no, it was a launch title in America, but it just, for whatever reason, it didn't pick up. Maybe everybody was just playing SoulCalibur, which I can completely understand. Let's go on to number 7. And then we got one more after that. Number 7 is another one. This is a game that ends up, if anybody ever does like top 10, like weirdest games list, you know, like they'll have LSD Dream Emulator or something like that on such lists. This is one that'll end up on those often enough. And that is 1999's Seaman, not Seaman, Seaman. This was an odd duck. I bought it, sight unseen, even though you look at the back of the box, and it was a big box because it came with a microphone adapter to, you know, that they had the microphone on it, that or extension, you could call it, I guess, that plugged into the controller, because you had to speak to this creature. You were basically like training a creature, like this fish in the water that had a human face, which is why it's called Seaman, I guess. So you're in this lab and you're talking to this, and you just watch this fish go around and talk and do whatever else, and you talk back to it. And you know, the goal is to like have this thing evolve. It's a very, very strange game. I bought it sight unseen because I found out that the fish was voiced by Leonard Nimoy. And I said, you know, if Grandpa's going to be a fish, I'm on. It's hard to explain. Like, go on YouTube and look up, you know, gameplay videos of people playing this game. It's fucking weird. But it's also like, I don't want to call it hypnotic, but like it's just strangely enjoyable. I found out, I did not know this. I found out this fairly recently, that there was a sequel made, which I can't believe, because I cannot imagine this game sold well. But there was a sequel made called Seaman 2 for the PlayStation 2. Now, it was only released in Japan. Nobody's done any, and I don't even know how this would work, because I'm sure the fish in Japan would want you to speak Japanese. So unless you know Japanese, you're kind of screwed probably in getting able to really play this, even if somebody like put subtitles on it somehow. But I'm amazed that there was a second one. I'd love to play it. I've seen it in action. It looks just as wild, a little bit more enhanced. I recommend checking that out as well. But these are the kinds of games that came out of really the 5th and 6th generation of consoles, where people were experimenting. Okay, what can we do with these 3D worlds? We perfected largely what we can do with a 2D world, though many would argue that actually the 2D world wasn't perfected until Stardew Valley came out, which, hey, I hear you. But what do we do with these 3D worlds? Yeah, the games industry was figuring out. So there's a lot of experimentation, and you end up with these insane things like Seaman. So go look it up. You got to see it to believe it. But it's something that has to be on this list. Number 8. So no, it's not another fighting game. It could be. Because you had Fighting Vipers 2. Like I said, you had Marvel vs. Capcom 2. You had Ready to Rumble Boxing. Those games were awesome at the time. Could have easily been on there. I'm going to put in Eraser. Now, it's not, we already mentioned San Francisco Rush 2049. That could have been on here. Hydro Thunder got an independent release on the Dreamcast as well. Arguably its best home release. That could have been on here as well. But I'm going to go with Sega GT, which came out in 2000. And this is going to lead into a little bit of a larger conversation. Sega GT was basically virtual racing perfected, even though I think virtual racing was already pretty perfect. Even in its low polygon count, as I've said often, I feel like that always made it seem a lot more futuristic, and just it gave an aesthetic that it was just always really cool and lived up to the Virtua. But Sega GT, this is the game because, for people that actually did play the Saturn, Daytona USA on the Saturn was one of the real hot tickets on that system in America anyway. And Sega GT, I kind of feel like was the real successor to what Daytona USA had done. And it is a slick racer. I think it's better than Ridge Racer. It did not go to the levels of, like, say, Gran Turismo, but it certainly had its place. Racing games would get to a whole other level when you get into, like, Need for Speed, Most Wanted, and Carbon, or, the Midnight Club games and so on. It would turn into a whole other thing. But your more traditional straight shooter, let's get to the racing games, I feel like Sega GT was really a piece of perfection. And I'm disappointed that this is a game that hasn't been really re-released anywhere. And, it's one of those, easy to pick up, difficult to master. It's one of those kinds of games, but just tons and tons of fun. Had 4-player, which was nice because the Dreamcast, of course, had 4 ports, stock for controllers. Great soundtrack. Everything about it was cool. Even the customization options were really, really cool. Didn't get as nutty as Gran Turismo. And I don't say that with disrespect. Just when you start playing a Gran Turismo game, you're in it for life. And Sega GT, you didn't have to be in it for life. And so I love this game. And again, it's sadly one that's never really been ported, nor has ever really had a really top tier sequel, I feel, or a sequel that got treated with as much respect. So that's our top 8. But we want to talk about some of Sega's other ventures into sports here in a second. So you have number 1, SoulCalibur, number 2, Heavy Metal, Geomatrix, number 3, Jet Grind Radio, number 4, Project Justice, number 5, Star Wars Episode 1, Jedi Power Battles. Star Wars Racer, by the way, Episode 1 Racer was on Dreamcast, and for a long time, that was like the best looking version of it. But continuing, number 6 is Virtua Fighter 3 TB, number 7, Seaman, and number 8, Sega GT. Now, Sega, after having issues with securing, like, say, the Madden games, or some other popular EA series of sports games, which, whether I like it or not, and actually there's some sports games I really like, kind of like I mentioned, Virtua Tennis. To be a successful console, you have to have sports games. You have to have that football game. You have to have that basketball game. You have to, whatever. Okay. Sega decided, well, if we can't get anybody on board, we'll make our own. And they basically started the entire 2K series. They started the whole, like NFL 2000, NFL 2001, and so on. And these games were real advancements in what was possible in a football or basketball game. Even just on the customization options, the fact that you could create your own teams, you could do all these other wild things and, like, really get knee deep. I've talked about, like, SmackDown 2, how that was such a great wrestling game because of the customization. The Sega 2K games, we'll call them, sports games for the Dreamcast, were like SmackDown 2, where the levels of customization were phenomenal and the presentation overall was great. It's reminiscent to me because now, like, a lot of those features are commonplace in an EA series and so on. It's reminiscent to me of, like, how the XFL, which I know is coming back and The Rock owns it, but how the XFL, came out with all these interesting innovations for playing football, and everybody laughed at them at the time, but then the NFL ends up copying them, 10 years later, right? In the real world. I feel like this is the same case where everybody basically, laughed at what Sega did initially, and they just had to make differentiating games. And so they went that distance. And then they ended up copying them later on, especially after the Dreamcast tanked. But of course, the 2K series would kind of go on. But people forget about this little slice of history, just how the Dreamcast, if you are a sports game fan, and they took this seriously. They even released like a Sega Sports edition of the Dreamcast. It was all black. It was really cool. They knew they had a winner on their hands with this. Just not enough people, there was just that brand recognition of Madden 2000 or Madden 2001 or whatever that wouldn't get it over the hump. But these games are, the Sega 2K sports games are infinitely better than anything that was coming out at the time, other than maybe what Midway was doing with their more extreme sports games, like, NFL Blitz and so on. Yeah, that was a brilliant move, and people do not give those games the credit they deserve. And I'm not even really a sports guy, but I can appreciate, like, and in fact, I even wanted to play, like my buddy of mine at the time, he and we wanted to play, the Sega Sports like football games, because we love the fact that we could make our own teams. Like, oh, this is cool, and I mean, that it was, man, anyway, so there's so many games that I could bring up in here. The sports games, by the way, were what I was thinking of putting in instead of Jet Set Radio. But I talked about them anyway. There are some, there's some great gun games that existed for this. Of course, House of the Dead 2, like we mentioned, Virtua Cop 2, other great fighters like Fighting Vipers 2. In fact, it's not the only system to have a KISS game, but probably the best KISS, and I mean the band, game ever was originally released. I think it also came out on PC, but it was originally released on the Dreamcast, that being KISS Psycho Circus, The Nightmare Child in 2000. I mean, Bomberman Online, some of the online games that you were able to take advantage of for the first time with the Dreamcast were, unbelievable. I mean, there really are plenty of games that I couldn't even begin to list off on here that are worth your time to look into. And it's interesting too that, some games that got ported to the Dreamcast ended up being wildly superior to any other system that they were on. And that doesn't always happen, but this is a case where really it did. Skies of Arcadia, let me mention that, because like I said, there's an argument to be made next to like Radiant Historia that I think it's the greatest RPG ever made. Skies of Arcadia, they did end up re-releasing that for the GameCube as Skies of Arcadia Legends. Skies of Arcadia Legends is the best way to play that game. If you only have a Dreamcast, you don't want a GameCube, fine. Play Skies of Arcadia on your Dreamcast. Go ahead and rock the little mini games in the VMU. You're in for a great time. That could easily be the number one on this list. But I just, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, no, you're going to get a much better experience and a richer experience, even though it's already great, on the GameCube. So you might want to try it there. But anyway, there is a nice encapsulating look at the Sega Dreamcast, the last of the Babylon State. No, the last of the Sega consoles, ultimately. And I mean, I know everybody's been wishing for a long time that Sega would just come back in and, I don't know, knock everybody's socks off. Sadly, I don't think we live in that world anymore, because now we're to the point where consoles don't even really matter. There's like talk, right? Like SNK is looking at coming out with a new console, and we don't mean like a Neo Geo Mini. We mean like they're coming out with a new Neo Geo. It's like some, I don't know, some Arabic billionaire, and literally, I think he's out of Saudi Arabia or something. He ended up buying a controlling stock in SNK. So weird. I mean, that's fine, and I know, look, I've been to the Middle East. I mean, they play video games like anybody else. It's just kind of surprising. And, and I know they're talking about coming out with a new console. I mean, I appreciate that there's people wanting to take the risk right now when it looks like the entire industry is going towards, streaming services basically for games. We'll have to see. I'd love it if Sega, came out of nowhere, but I don't, and it's not just because of COVID. I don't think we live, sadly, I don't think we live in that world anymore. Where, we're a, you could come in with AAA games and you could be, the console that everybody's talking about. We're just not in that age. There's a time where I think they could have done it, but I do think that time has passed, and it's sad. I wish they would re-release a mini Saturn, re-release a mini Dreamcast. Like, by all means, take advantage of your history. I really wish they would do that. Why they don't, I don't know. Especially, like I said, when they will come out with the weirdest little shit mini consoles like the Astro 6 or whatever else. And it's like, wait, what? You could do so much more money with a far less complex release. It just doesn't make any sense. But as I also said at the top, this is a system that's very easy to get your hands on and to, get into, like, install a mode in it, and you can download the disk images and have the day, and, have it rocking for a long time. Because, the number one part that goes bad is the optical disc drive. So don't have to worry about that anymore. So I recommend it. This is a system worthwhile having in your home arsenal of video game consoles or arsenal of video game history. I have a small one myself, and if you wanted to get started, this isn't a bad place to start. So the Sega Dreamcast, that's it. That's your top 8. And we'll be back with more Gaming Grid specials, and of course, more Sovryn tech to come. I'll see all of you, on the other side.
Game over.
So what do you use your computer for? Oh, you use it for creative projects? Whatever happened to plain old pencil and paper? I mean, what happens to your masterpiece when the power goes off? Food for thought.